Mountain Man marries fat mail-order bride as joke. The next day he was speechless. In a dusty frontier town, rough men laughed as a hermit was forced to marry a bride no one else wanted. They thought it was just a cruel jest until the church bell rang and the vows were real. That night, she bowed her head in prayer and served a meal that silenced every mocking tongue. But when a locked strongbox was opened, the truth thundered louder than hooves on hard earth. This woman held the deed to land the railroad would kill to take. Now the man who thought he'd made a joke finds himself standing between a bride, mocked for her size, and powerful men willing to spill blood. As danger closes in, faith and love may be the only weapons left. Will this unlikely marriage turn into the greatest blessing of his life, or the deadliest mistake he ever made? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty main street as Luke Harlan tied his horse to the hitching post outside Henderson's general store. His worn boots kicked up small clouds with each measured step, his tall frame casting a lean shadow against the weathered boardwalk. The usual quietness of the small mining town was broken by raucous laughter spilling from the direction of the saloon. Luke's shoulders tensed at the sound. He preferred the silence of his mountain cabin to the chaos of town, but supplies were running low. A man couldn't live on venison alone, and his coffee had run out 2 days ago. The thought of that morning's breakfast bland and bitter-free hastened his steps toward the store's entrance. The stagecoach's arrival interrupted his mission. It rolled into town with a clatter of wheels and the jingle of harness bells, drawing a crowd of miners who had spilled out of the saloon. Their loud voices carried across the street, sharp with cruel amusement. "Well, would you look at what we got here?" one miner called out, pointing as a woman struggled to descend from the coach. Luke's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. The woman was heavyset, her dark traveling dress dusty from the journey. She moved with careful dignity despite the jeers, her head held high as she retrieved her carpet bag from the driver. "Ain't you Jed Morton's mail-order bride?" another miner shouted. "Reckon he took one look at your picture and lit out for California." The woman Rona Bell Duncan, Luke would later learn, clutched her bag closer but didn't respond to the taunts. Her face remained composed, though Luke caught the slight trembling of her lower lip. "Someone ought to do the Christian thing," a third miner drawled, his words slurring together. "Hey, Harlan, you're out in the mountains all alone. Why don't you take her off our hands?" Before Luke could retreat, rough hands pushed him forward. He stumbled, finding himself at the center of the gathering crowd. The woman's eyes met his warm brown and full of quiet strength despite her humiliation. "What do you say, mountain man?" The first miner grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Preacher Thompson's just over in the church. We could have ourselves a wedding right now." Luke's throat went dry. He opened his mouth to refuse to end this cruel spectacle, but the words wouldn't come. The crowd pressed closer, their laughter growing louder, more insistent. He glanced at Rona Bell, seeing in her face a mixture of resignation and determination that struck him to his core. "Fine," he heard himself say, the word falling like a stone in suddenly quiet air. Someone ran to fetch Preacher Thompson from the tiny church that served the mining camp. The crowd herded Luke and Rona toward the church's weather-beaten steps, their mockery now tinged with disbelief that their joke had gone this far. The ceremony that followed felt both endless and unreal. Preacher Thompson, though clearly uncomfortable, proceeded with proper solemnity. The interior of the church was cool and dim, dust motes dancing in the light that filtered through its few small windows. "Do you, Luke Harlan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Luke's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. I do. And do you, Rona Bell Duncan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Rona Bell's answer rang clear and steady, though she kept her eyes downcast. I do? The miner's laughter, which had started as scattered snickers, grew to fill the small church. Luke felt shame burn in his chest, shame at his part in this mockery, shame at his inability to stop it, shame at the way his new bride stood so still and dignified while being made the butt of their cruel joke. When the ceremony concluded, Luke offered his arm with awkward formality. Rona Bell placed her gloved hand lightly upon it, and together they walked out into the late afternoon sun. The miners followed, calling out suggestions and jokes that made Luke's ears burn. Reckon you ought to treat your bride to supper, someone shouted. Looks like she enjoys her victuals. More laughter followed them down the street toward the town's only restaurant. Luke felt Rona Bell's hand tighten slightly on his arm, but her face remained composed, refusing to give their tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her distress. The weight of what he'd allowed to happen settled heavy on Luke's shoulders as they approached the restaurant's door. This woman, this stranger, was now his wife, joined to him by lawful ceremony, no matter that it had begun as a cruel jest. He held the door for her, watching as she entered with that same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the ordeal, and wondered what in heaven's name he was supposed to do now. The church hall buzzed with chatter and mocking laughter as Luke and Rona Bell entered. Wooden tables had been hastily pushed together, creating one long surface where miners lounged, elbows propped, waiting for entertainment. Luke's stomach churned with shame, but Rona Bell moved with purpose toward her traveling trunk, which someone had dragged in from the stagecoach. Ain't you gonna cook for your new husband? One miner called out, triggering fresh guffaws. Rona Bell didn't respond. Instead, she opened her trunk and began removing carefully wrapped parcels. The smell of rosemary and thyme filled the air as she unwrapped a cloth-covered roast, still warm from its journey. From another package came fresh bread, its crust perfectly brown. Luke watched, amazed, as she organized her ingredients with quiet efficiency. The church's small kitchen came alive under her touch. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew their way around the hearth, her movements graceful despite the cramped space. When the food was arranged on a long table, Rona Bell stood at its head. The miners fell quiet, curious despite themselves. Her voice, when it came, was clear and gentle. Dear Lord, she began, hands clasped before her, we thank you for your endless mercy and the bounty before us. We ask your blessing on this food and on all gathered here today. Amen. The simple prayer settled over the room like a blanket. Where there had been jeers, now there was only the scrape of chairs and the clinking of plates. Luke watched the miners' faces as they tasted her cooking, eyebrows raised in surprise. Heads nodded in appreciation. The roast was tender, perfectly seasoned, and the bread still warm enough to melt butter. Luke found himself studying his unexpected bride. Lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, and her eyes, those same eyes that had met his, with such dignity during the ceremony, sparkled with quiet satisfaction as she served each person. Even those who had been cruelest received generous portions and a gentle smile. When everyone had eaten their fill, the mood in the hall had shifted. The miners shuffled their feet, avoiding each other's eyes, perhaps remembering their mothers' teachings about manners and mercy. A few mumbled thanks as they filed out into the evening ere. Luke helped Rona Bell pack her trunk back onto his wagon, acutely aware of how little he'd said throughout the meal. The drive to his cabin stretched before them like a challenge. As they set out, the town's lights fading behind them, he cleared his throat. I'm sorry, he muttered, the words feeling insufficient. About all this, the wedding, the way they treated you. Rona Bell adjusted her shawl against the cooling mountain air. You didn't abandon me to them, she said softly. That counts for something, Mr. Harlan. Luke, he corrected automatically, then fell silent again, unsure what else to say. The wagon wheels creaked as they climbed higher into the mountains. Shadows lengthened across the trail, and Luke lit the wagon's lamp, its glow creating a small circle of warmth around them. Rhona Bell sat straight-backed beside him, her carpet bag clutched in her lap, taking in the wild beauty of the landscape. His cabin appeared as a dark shape against the starlit sky. Luke felt a fresh wave of embarrassment as he helped Rhona Bell down from the wagon. The cabin was small, just one room with a stone hearth, built more for function than comfort. He'd never thought about how it might look to someone else's eyes. "I'll make up a bed for you near the fire," he said gruffly, gathering blankets. "It gets cold up here at night." Rhona Bell thanked him quietly, accepting the arrangement without complaint. She moved around the cabin's small space, unpacking only what she needed for the night. Her movements were careful, considered, as if she was trying not to disturb the bachelor routine of the place. Luke lay on his narrow cot against the far wall, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows. He could hear Rhona Bell's steady breathing, but couldn't tell if she slept. Her composure throughout the day haunted him, where others would have broken down in tears or fled in humiliation. She had stood firm, turning mockery into respect through nothing more than dignity and kindness. He shifted restlessly, uncomfortable with the feeling stirring in his chest. This woman was a stranger, thrust into his life by cruel circumstance and his own cowardice in the face of mob mentality. Yet there was something about her, the way her eyes shone with inner strength, how she blessed those who cursed her that kept him from sleep. The fire slowly died down to embers, but Luke remained awake, unsettled by the presence of this unexpected wife and the quiet grace with which she had handled everything thrown at her. That morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting a golden rectangle across the plank floor. Rhona Bell was already up, her bedding neatly folded beside the hearth. She knelt before her traveling trunk, carefully removing items and arranging them with methodical precision. Luke watched from his cot, oddly fascinated by this quiet invasion of his space. Her movements were unhurried, respectful of the cabin's sparse furnishings. When she reached the bottom of the trunk, she pulled out a small iron strongbox, its dark surface worn smooth with age. The box's lock clicked open under her key. Luke caught a glimpse of folded papers inside, the edges crisp and official-looking. His curiosity got the better of him. "Important papers?" he asked, his voice rough from sleep. Rhona Bell looked up, considering him for a moment. "My brother's legacy," she said softly. "He died 2 months ago in a railroad accident near Cedar Creek." Luke sat up straighter. Cedar Creek was just over the mountain, where the railroad was pushing its way through the territory. He'd heard stories of accidents and of incidents that weren't accidents at all. "These deeds," Rhona continued, touching the papers gently, "they grant title to Willow Valley, 500 acres of good land with year-round water." She paused, watching Luke's reaction. Land the railroad wants badly. Luke felt his chest tighten. Willow Valley was the most fertile stretch of land for 50 miles. He'd trapped there, in winters past, knowing its value. The railroad had been trying to claim every productive acre along their planned route. "That's why you came west?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I came to marry a man who promised to help defend the land." Rhona's voice held no bitterness, only calm certainty. "He never appeared, but God provided another way. Through you." Luke stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. Their mock wedding suddenly felt like a noose around his neck. "The railroad don't play fair," he said gruffly. "They've got hired guns, corrupt judges." "I know," Rhona said simply. "That's why I needed a husband. A woman alone can't hold such land, not against their kind of pressure." The morning passed in uncomfortable silence as Luke processed this revelation. By afternoon, he needed supplies and answers. He rode into Silver Bluff, leaving Rona Bell organizing his meager kitchen supplies. The saloon was busy for early afternoon. Luke ordered coffee, settling into a corner where he could listen. It didn't take long. "Heard about that fat woman's land claim?" One miner muttered to another. "Prime Valley, worth a fortune once the railroad comes through." Railroads. Offering rewards for information about disputed claims, his companion replied. "Might be worth looking into." "Shame if something happened to those papers of hers," a third man added. "Or to that mountain man she's tied herself to." Luke's coffee turned bitter in his mouth. He'd expected trouble, but not so soon. The sun was setting when he rode back to the cabin, shadows stretching long across the valley floor. He found Rona Bell seated by the hearth, reading from a small leather Bible. She looked up as he entered, noting his troubled expression. "There's talk in town," he said, hanging his hat by the door. "About your land claim. I expected as much." She closed her Bible carefully. "Are you afraid, Luke?" The question caught him off guard. He was, but not in the way she might think. He feared for her safety, this strange woman who had walked into his life trailing danger behind her like a shadow. "Would you like to hear something that brings me comfort?" she asked, not waiting for his answer. Opening her Bible again, she began to recite, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Her voice was steady, melodious. Luke found himself sinking into a chair, the familiar words washing over him. He'd heard them before, long ago, but they felt different now. "Say it with me," she encouraged, starting again. Luke hesitated, then joined her quietly, his deeper voice matching her cadence. The psalm filled the cabin as evening settled around them, and for a moment, the threats gathering outside seemed to recede. "My cup runneth over." They finished together in the silence that followed. Luke studied Rona Bell's face in the fading light. Her eyes held the same quiet strength he'd witnessed during yesterday's mockery, but now he understood its source better. Her faith wasn't just words. It was a shield she carried, as real as any gun. The thought both unsettled and comforted him. He'd spent years keeping to himself, avoiding other people's troubles. Now he was married to a woman whose very presence invited danger, yet she faced it with nothing more than prayer and quiet. Determination. Dawn painted the mountains gold as Luke saddled his horse. The morning air held a bite, warning of autumn's approach. He glanced back at the cabin where Rona Bell stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. "I'll fetch those supplies we discussed," he said, adjusting his hat. "Won't be more than a few hours." She nodded, already turning back to her morning tasks. Luke marveled at how quickly she'd settled in, as if she'd always belonged in his sparse cabin. The ride into Silver Bluff took longer than usual. Luke found himself thinking about the strongbox hidden beneath Rona's trunk, about the danger it represented. When he finally reached town, the streets were busy with morning traffic miners heading to their claims, merchants opening their shops. He just finished loading supplies at the general store when a familiar voice called out, "Harlan, a word." Sheriff Tom Grady stood near the hitching post, accompanied by a well-dressed stranger. The man's suit was too fine for Silver Bluff, his boots too shiny. A railroad man, Luke realized, his jaw tightening. "Sheriff," Luke acknowledged, keeping his voice neutral. "Something wrong?" "This here's Mr. Richardson from the railroad company," Grady said, shifting uncomfortably. "He'd like to discuss your wife's land claim." The stranger stepped forward, all polished smiles and smooth words. "Mr. Harlan, I'll be direct. That claim your wife holds, it's worthless. The railroad was granted those rights months ago." Luke squared his shoulders. Funny, Her brother's papers say different. Papers can be challenged, Richardson said softly. Courts favor progress, Mr. Harlan. Progress means railroads. Why put your wife through the stress? Have her sign over the claim. We're prepared to offer fair compensation. Not interested. Luke turned to his horse. The sheriff cleared his throat. Luke, be reasonable. Railroad's coming whether folks like it or not. Better to profit than fight. That all? Luke swung into his saddle, looking down at both men. Because I've got chores waiting. Richardson's smile hardened. Consider carefully, Mr. Harlan. Accidents happen in mining towns. Would be a shame if any befell your new bride. Luke's hand twitched toward his gun, but he forced it still. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, anger burning in his chest. The sun was high when he returned home. Rona looked up from her mending as he entered, reading his mood in the set of his shoulders. They threatened you, she said. It wasn't a question. Luke hung his hat with more force than necessary. Railroad sent their man. Claims your brother's deed is worthless. He turned to face her. They won't stop, Rona. This'll get worse before it gets better. To his surprise, she smiled. Then we must give them something else to consider. She set aside her mending. I've been thinking. This town needs a proper school. School? Luke blinked at the sudden change of subject. Until one's built, we could hold Sunday lessons here. For the children. Her eyes sparkled. We must live as if we belong, Luke. Make ourselves part of the community. It's harder to destroy what people care about. Luke opened his mouth to object, then closed it. Her logic was simple but sound. You really think folks will send their young'uns up here? After that mockery wedding? Let's find out. She stood, smoothing her skirts. I've already mentioned it to Mrs. Peterson at the store. She seemed interested. Luke grumbled, but didn't argue. That evening, to his amazement, 3 women arrived, with their children in tow. 2 boys, 3 girls, all scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best. Rona had arranged the cabin's few chairs in a circle. She sat in the middle, opening her Bible with practiced care. Luke leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as she began to read. Her voice filled the small space, steady and warm. The children sat transfixed as she told the story of David and Goliath, making the ancient tale come alive. Even Luke found himself drawn in, remembering his own mother reading these same words long ago. Soon, the cabin rang with children's voices learning hymns. Laughter bubbled up as Rona taught them hand motions to go with the songs. The mothers relaxed, sharing knowing looks as their children blossomed under Rona's gentle guidance. Luke remained by the door, caught between his instinct for solitude and a growing admiration for his accidental wife's quiet strength. She transformed his silent cabin into something else entirely, something warmer, more alive. Outside, darkness gathered. In the shadows beyond the lamplight spilling from the windows, a horse shifted restlessly. Its rider watched the scene. Within, noting each face, each name. After a long moment, he turned his mount and rode away toward town, his expression grim in the gathering night. 3 days after the Sunday school gathering, Luke and Rona headed into Silver Bluff for supplies. The morning sun beat down on the dusty street as they tied their horses outside the general store. Luke noticed how Rona held her head high despite the sideways glances from townsfolk. We're running low on flour, she said, adjusting her bonnet. And perhaps some sugar, if we can spare it. Luke nodded, finding himself oddly protective as they entered the store. The bell tinkled above them, and the shopkeeper's wife smiled warmly at Rona. Their Sunday school had already changed some attitudes in town. As Rona examined the flour barrels, the door swung open. 3 miners stumbled in, still drunk from the night before. Luke recognized them from the saloon troublemakers, the lot of them. Wow, Lukey here, the tallest one drawled. nudging his companions. "It's the fat bride and her mountain man." Luke's shoulders tensed. He watched Rona's hands pause over the flower, though her face remained calm. "Reckon she ate her first husband." Another miner guffawed. "Better watch yourself, Harlan." The third man joined in. "Yeah, she's big enough to feed a whole mining camp." Luke felt something snap inside him. Years of solitude had taught him to avoid conflict, to retreat to his mountain sanctuary. But watching these men mock Rona, who had shown nothing but kindness since arriving, awakened something fierce in his chest. Without a word, he crossed the store in 3 long strides. His fist connected with the tall miner's jaw before anyone could react. The man stumbled backward, crashing through the door and landing face first in the muddy street. The saloon across the way emptied as men rushed to see the commotion. Luke stood in the doorway, his breathing heavy, as the other 2 miners backed away. "Anyone else got something to say about my wife?" His voice was quiet but carried down the street. The fallen miner scrambled to his feet, mud dripping from his clothes. He lunged at Luke with a roar. They crashed into a barrel of nails, sending them scattering across the wooden sidewalk. Luke took a hit to the ribs, but managed to land another solid punch that sent his opponent reeling. "That's enough." "Sheriff." Grady's voice cut through the chaos. Austin the chaos. He pushed through the gathering crowd, hand on his gun belt. "Break it up or I'm fining the lot of you." Luke stepped back, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The tall miner spat blood into the dirt, glaring but making no move to continue the fight. "He started it, Sheriff," one of the other miners whined. "Don't care who started it," Grady snapped. "I'm finishing it. Now clear out, all of you." As the crowd dispersed, Luke noticed something had changed in how they looked at him and at Rona. There was a new respect in their eyes, perhaps even a touch of shame. He'd lived among them for years, but kept to himself. Now they'd seen him stand for something, for someone. Back at the cabin, Rona insisted on tending to his hands. She worked silently, cleaning the scrapes with water and witch hazel. Her touch was gentle, but Luke could see the hint of a smile playing at her lips. "Didn't expect my quiet mountain man to be such a fighter," she said at last, wrapping a clean cloth around his knuckles. Luke felt his ears grow warm. "They had no right speaking to you that way. No, they didn't." She tied off the bandage. "But I've heard worse. Words can't hurt me as much as they think." Still, Luke flexed his fingers carefully. A man ought to defend his wife. Rona's eyes sparkled. "Even if she's just a wife by accident?" Later, as they sat over bowls of fresh rabbit stew, Luke struggled to find the right words. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, despite the wind howling outside. "I reckon I've lived too long by myself," he finally said, staring into his bowl. "Forgot how to care for anybody else, how to let anybody close." Rona ladled more stew into his bowl. "A home isn't built in a day, Luke. Harlan, it's made of small things, a kind word here, a shared meal there. Even a fight in the street when it's for the right reason." The lamplight cast a gentle glow across her face, and Luke felt something shift in his heart. The silence that had been his only companion for so many years didn't seem so comfortable anymore. Here, in this cabin with this unexpected wife, he'd found something he hadn't even known he was missing. "I ain't much good at words," he admitted. "But I'm glad you're here, Rona." She smiled, and the wind's lonesome howl seemed far away. "I know, Luke, I know." The first snow of winter swept into the valley like a white curtain drawn across the mountains. Luke stood at the chopping block, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Each blow sent splinters of pine flying as he built up the woodpile that would see them through the cold snap dot from inside the cabin. Rona's clear voice carried through the thin walls. She was humming Amazing Grace while preparing their evening meal. The familiar hymn mixed with the thunk of his axe and the whisper of falling snow, creating a peace Luke hadn't known in years. He paused, breath frosting in the air, and studied the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. It looked different, now lived in, cared for. Rona had hung curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, and she'd scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, when the wind picked up and the temperature dropped further. Luke carried one last armload of wood inside. Rona looked up from where she was turning strips of venison over the fire, her cheeks flushed from the heat. "Storm's coming," she said, gesturing to the window, where snow pelted against the glass. "Good thing you got that wood in." Luke nodded, stamping snow from his boots. The cabin smelled of roasting meat and pine boughs Rona had gathered to freshen the air. His stomach growled at the aroma of their supper as night settled in. The wind battered the cabin walls, but inside they sat warm by the fire. Rona poured hot tea into tin cups while Luke carved the venison. The flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, and for once, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strained. "Tell me about your home," Luke said suddenly, surprising himself. "Back in Missouri." Rona's eyes softened as she wrapped her hands around her cup. "We had a small farm near Independence. Nothing grand, but Mama kept a fine garden. Papa worked as a wheelwright when he wasn't tending crops." She smiled at the memory. "I learned to cook at her elbow, though she always said I had a better hand with bread than she did." Luke found himself leaning forward, drawn by the warmth in her voice. "And your brother? Thomas?" Rona's smile turned wistful. He was the dreamer in the family, always reading about the West, planning his fortune. When he took work with the railroad, he wrote home about the beautiful valley he'd found. She touched the strongbox that sat near her bed. He filed the claim, sent the papers home for safekeeping. Then came the telegram about the accident. The fire ponged, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled like a lonely wolf. "I prayed for guidance," Rona continued softly. "For months I prayed. Then I saw the advertisement for a mail-order bride out here, near Thomas's land. It felt like an answer. Even though your intended never showed, the Lord works in mysterious ways." She gave Luke a gentle look. "Here I am, ain't I?" Luke stared into his tea, feeling the weight of her gaze. The warmth of the fire and her presence loosened something in his chest that had been tight for years. "I had a family once," he said quietly. "Wife, 2 little ones." He hadn't spoken of them in so long. The words felt rusty in his mouth. Fever took them. Summer of 1873. I wasn't there, was off trading furs. By the time I got back, he trailed off, but Rona didn't rush to fill the silence. She just waited, her face full of understanding rather than pity. "Wandered after that," Luke continued. "Trapped, hunted. Figured it was easier being alone than risking loss again." He looked around the cabin at the touches of home Rona had added. "Reckon I was wrong about that." Rona's laugh was soft and warm as sunshine. "Well, Mr. Harlan, better late than never to learn." As the evening wore on, Luke found himself sitting closer to the fire, closer to Rona. Her laughter came easier now, and he discovered he liked the sound. It filled the empty corners of the cabin, drove back the loneliness that had been his only companion for so long. When Rona finally retired to her bed near the hearth, Luke remained by the fire, watching the flames dance lower. The storm still raged outside, but it couldn't touch the warmth within. For the first time in years, he didn't dread the thought of tomorrow. Instead, he found himself looking forward to another day of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the simple comfort of not being alone. He added another log to the fire, listening to Rona's steady breathing mix with the crackle of wood. The bitter cold that had gripped his heart for so long was beginning to thaw. replaced by something he'd thought he'd never feel again: hope. 3 days later, the storm finally broke. Sunlight sparkled across fresh snow as Luke saddled his horse. For the ride into Silver Bluff, the town needed checking, and their supplies were running low. "Mind you bring back some salt," Rona called from the doorway, wrapping her shawl tight against the morning chill. "And perhaps news of when the circuit preacher's due." Luke nodded, touched by her quiet faith, even as his own heart remained uncertain. The horse's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as he guided it down the mountain trail, his breath frosting in the crisp air. Silver Bluff stirred with unusual activity when he arrived. A private rail car sat on the siding, its polished wood and brass fittings marking it as belonging to someone important. Well-dressed men hurried between the sheriff's office and the telegraph station. Luke tied his horse outside the general store, instantly wary. Inside, the shopkeeper wouldn't meet his eyes while measuring out salt and coffee. Through the window, Luke spotted Sheriff Grady posting a notice on the jail's bulletin board. A small crowd gathered to read it. Stepping back outside, Luke shouldered his way through the onlookers. His stomach tightened as he read the official declaration. "Notice is hereby given that all land claims in Thunder Valley are declared null and void pending review by railroad authorities." "That'd be my doing," came a smooth voice behind him. Luke turned to face a well-dressed man with a silver watch chain across his vest. Behind him stood 2 armed guards. Silas Blackwood, the man introduced himself with a thin smile. "Regional Director for the railroad. I'm afraid your wife's claim to Thunder Valley won't stand. We have documentation showing prior purchase." He pulled papers from his coat. "Perhaps you could convince her to be reasonable about this. The railroad offers fair compensation." Luke's hands clenched into fists. "That land belongs to Rona through her brother's rightful claim. A claim that's now invalid," Sheriff Grady cut in, though he wouldn't meet Luke's eyes. "Best accept the railroad's offer, Harlan. Make this easy on everyone." Luke spat in the snow. Ain't nothing easy about theft dressed up in fancy papers. He stormed to his horse, fury building with each step. The supplies could wait. Rona needed warning. The ride home seemed endless. Luke's mind raced with dark possibilities. He'd seen how railroads operated, how they used money and pressure to get their way. Sometimes pressure turned to violence. Rona stood at the washboard when he burst through the door. One look at his face told her something was wrong. "They've declared your claim invalid," Luke said, the words bitter in his mouth. Railroad baron showed up with papers. Sheriff siding with them. Rona's hands stilled on the washing, but her voice remained steady. "Papers can lie. God's truth cannot be erased by mere ink." She dried her hands and moved to the strongbox. "Perhaps we missed something in Thomas's documents. He was thorough in his dealings." Luke lit the lamp as darkness gathered outside. Together, they spread the papers across the rough wooden table. Faded maps showed survey lines. Land office receipts recorded payments. Letters detailed Thomas's careful steps in securing the claim. "Here," Rona said, pulling a folded document from the bottom. "This one bears the governor's seal, but..." She squinted at the smudged text. "The writing's too faint to make out proper." Luke studied the paper. Important words were blurred, but the seal looked genuine. "We need to keep this safe until we can prove what it says. Could be the key to everything. We'll store it separate from the rest," Rona decided. "Somewhere they won't think to look. Won't matter if they don't give us time to use it." Luke moved to the window, peering into the gathering dark. Lantern light flickered between the trees. "Railroad's got men watching the cabin. Already?" Rona's voice held concern, but not fear. Luke checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "They won't wait long to press their advantage." He positioned the weapon near his chair. "But we're not yielding. Not to false papers, not to pressure, not to anything." Rona touched his arm gently. "Together, then." "Together," Luke agreed, his voice gruff with emotion. The lanterns continued their slow circle around the cabin, like predators testing for weakness. But inside, Luke and Rona bent again over their papers, searching for the proof that would protect their home. While his rifle stayed close at hand, word of Rona's land dispute spread through Silver Bluff like wildfire. The town split into whispered camps, some backing the railroad's promise of progress, others troubled by the naked grab for land. On Tuesday morning, Martha Tanner, a miner's widow, trudged through the snow to Luke's cabin with a covered basket. "For the children's lessons," she whispered, revealing fresh-baked bread. "My Jimmy's reading better already, thanks to your missus." More visitors followed. Sarah Cooper brought preserves, and Emma Watson arrived with knitted scarves for the best little ones. They came in ones and twos, careful not to draw attention, expressing gratitude for Rona's patient teaching. "The children need learning more than the railroad needs land," Emma declared softly, watching her daughter practice letters by the cabin's warm hearth. Yet not everyone felt the same. At the saloon, miners spoke eagerly of promised jobs laying track. The general store owner dreamed of increased business. Luke noticed former friends turning away when he passed, choosing prosperity over principle. Sunday arrived crisp and clear. Luke and Rona sat in their usual back pew as Pastor Ellis rose to speak. The preacher's gentle voice trembled slightly as he addressed the congregation. "Let us seek peace in all things," he urged, his eyes darting to where Railroad Director Blackwood sat prominently in the front row. "The good book teaches us to live in harmony with our neighbors." Luke studied the pastor's face, noting the fear behind his peaceful words. Ellis had always been mild-mannered, but now he seemed almost haunted. After the final hymn, Luke lingered outside, pretending to adjust his horse's saddle while other churchgoers gathered nearby. "Tomorrow night," a rough voice muttered, "we'll smoke them out proper. Railroad's offering extra to anyone who helps convince them to leave." "What about the woman?" another asked. "She run quick enough once the shooting starts." "Mountain man, too, if he's smart." Luke's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but Rona's appearance stopped him. She smiled and nodded to the plotters, as if she hadn't heard their threats, though her face had gone pale. That evening, Luke worked by lamplight, reinforcing the cabin's shutters with extra boards. He checked his rifle for the 10th time, counting bullets and placing them within easy reach. "Violence isn't the answer," Rona said softly from where she sat mending by the fire. "You know that, Luke. Sometimes a man's got no choice," he growled, hammering another nail. "They mean to drive us out or worse. There's always a choice." Rona set down her sewing. "If we meet force with force, we're no better than them. We lose our moral standing, maybe even our souls." "Moral standing won't stop bullets," Luke snapped, frustration breaking through. "I won't let them hurt you or take what's rightfully yours." Their argument was interrupted by singing outside. Clear children's voices rose in the evening air, carrying the hymn Rona had taught them just days before. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." Luke moved to the window, rifle ready. But instead of threats, he found a gathering of students and their mothers, holding lanterns in the growing dark. They stood in the snow, singing Rona's hymn as if in defiance of the threats against her. "That saved a wretch like me." Rona joined him at the window, her hand finding his arm. "See? This is how we fight, Luke. Not with guns, but with love and teaching and faith. They can't take that from us, no matter what they do." Luke watched the children's faces, glowing in the lantern light. He thought of how Rona had transformed his silent cabin into a place of learning and song. How she brought life back to his hardened heart. Maybe she was right. Maybe there were weapons stronger than rifles. Slowly, he set the gun aside. I reckon you might have a point, he admitted gruffly. But I'll keep watching, all the same. We'll both watch, Rona agreed. And pray. And teach. And trust that good people will choose right over easy in the end. The hymn continued outside, carried on young voices made strong by Rona's patient instruction. Luke realized that while his gun might protect them for a night, the way of faith and persistence could win them something far more precious, a real home. Supported by neighbors who'd chosen to stand with them against power and greed. He squeezed Rona's hand, finally understanding that the strength he'd always sought in solitude might actually be found in connection, in community, in the courage to trust rather than threaten. The children's voices rose higher, and for a moment, even Luke's doubts were drowned in their song of amazing grace. January wrapped Silver Bluff in a thick blanket of white. The days grew shorter, and the mountain winds howled fierce across the valley. Yet inside Luke and Rona's cabin, warmth bloomed like early spring. Each morning found them working side by side, their routines falling into comfortable rhythm. Luke no longer startled at the sound of Rona's footsteps or the gentle clatter of her cooking. Instead, he found himself watching her, admiring how she moved through their shared space with quiet grace. "Water's running low," Luke announced one crisp morning, frost painting the window panes in delicate patterns. "Need to haul some from the creek." "I'll help," Rona offered, already reaching for her shawl. "2 buckets carry easier than 1. Luke started to protest but stopped himself. That was her way making light work of heavy burdens by sharing them. Together they trudged through knee-deep snow to the creek, their breath clouding in the winter air. The ice had to be broken first, and Luke showed her how to chip carefully at the edges. "Like this?" Rona asked, mimicking his technique. "Just so." Luke nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to teach instead of just do. Steady now. Their buckets filled, they made their way back, taking turns breaking trail through the deep snow. Halfway home, Rona stumbled slightly. Luke caught her elbow, steadying her with a gentleness that would have surprised him months ago. "Much obliged," she smiled, her cheeks pink from cold and something more. The afternoon found them in the barn, Luke showing Rona how to check the livestock's feed. She already knew more than he expected, having grown up on a farm herself. Her capable hands measured grain while she hummed hymns, the melody mixing with the soft nickering of horses. "You've got a way with them," Luke observed, watching his usually skittish Marries nuzzle Rona's palm. "Animals know when they're loved," she replied simply, "same as people." As dusk approached, Luke split wood while Rona stacked it carefully against the cabin wall. The steady rhythm of his axe punctuated their comfortable silence. When he paused to wipe his brow, he caught her watching him with warm eyes. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking how different everything is now," she said, softly. "How much has changed since that day in town." Night fell early, as it did in deep winter. They settled in their usual spots by the fire, Luke in his chair, Rona on the small sofa she'd brought from her trunk. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, while outside, snow fell in gentle waves. "I need to thank you," Luke said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. Rona looked up from her mending, surprised. "For what?" "For teaching me patience. For showing me there's more strength in kindness than in anger." He stared into the fire, fighting for words. "I was hard as stone. Before you came. Thought that's what it took to survive out here. And now?" she asked quietly. "Now I reckon there's better ways to live than just surviving." Rona set aside her sewing, her hands trembling slightly. "Can I tell you something?" At his nod, she continued. "I used to lie awake at night, back home in Missouri, afraid I'd never know what it meant to have a real home. That no one would ever," she paused, gathering courage, "that no one would ever choose me for myself. Luke rose from his chair, crossing the kneel before her. His calloused hands found hers, strong and sure. "I choose you, Rona Bell," he declared, his voice thick with feeling. "Not from any joke or jest, not from duty or circumstance. I choose you because my heart knows it's home now." Tears spilled down Rona's cheeks, but her smile outshone them. "And I choose you, Luke Harlan, with all that I am." He drew her into his arms then, holding her close as if he'd never let go. The mock wedding that had brought them together faded like morning mist, replaced by this moment of true binding. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of joy and promise. Fire crackled softly, and outside the snow continued its gentle dance. But inside the cabin, something new and precious bloomed. The warmth that filled the room came not just from the hearth, but from two hearts that had finally found their way home. Luke pulled back just enough to see Rona's face, his thumb gently brushing away her tears. "Reckon we should tell the preacher. He needs to marry us proper this time." Rona laughed, the sound pure and sweet. "I'd say God already knows what's in our hearts. But yes, we can tell the preacher too." They stayed there by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms as the cabin glowed with warmth against the winter night. Their love, born in mockery but grown in truth, had transformed not just their marriage but their very souls. The winter morning, dawn clear and cold as Luke saddled his horse for the ride into town. They needed supplies, flour, salt, and ammunition, things that couldn't wait despite the railroad's threats. Rona stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. "Be careful," she said softly, touching his arm. "Something doesn't feel right today." Luke nodded, understanding her worry. "I'll keep my eyes sharp." He squeezed her hand before mounting up, the leather creaking beneath him. The trail to town wound through stands of pine and across open meadows glazed with frost. Luke kept to the trees when he could, years of mountain living having taught him the value of cover. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow, and his breath frosted in the air. He was halfway to town when he heard it, the subtle crack of a branch that didn't match his horse's footfalls. Luke tensed, scanning the tree line. Movement caught his eye, a flash of dark cloth against white snow. The gunshot cracked like thunder. White-hot pain blazed across Luke's side as the bullet found its mark. The force knocked him sideways, and he lost his grip on the reins. His horse reared in panic, throwing him clear. Luke hit the frozen ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Through blurring vision, he glimpsed a man in a black coat emerging from the trees, pistol raised, railroad-hired gun. Luke realized with cold clarity. He forced himself to move, ignoring the fire in his side. Rolling behind a fallen log, he drew his own weapon with trembling hands. More shots splintered bark around him. Luke returned fire once, twice, forcing the gunman back into cover. Using that moment, he pushed himself up and stumbled into deeper woods, leaving a trail of blood on pristine snow. The morning stretched into afternoon as Luke fought his way home. The wound burned like a brand, each step sending fresh waves of agony through his body. He lost his hat somewhere, and sweat froze on his brow despite the cold. Twice he had to stop, leaning against trees as the world spun around him. The sun was setting when he finally glimpsed the cabin through the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney. Rona was home. Luke tried to call out but found his voice too weak. He staggered the last few yards, barely staying upright. Rona must have heard him approach. The door flew open and she ran to him, catching him. As his legs gave way, "Luke!" Her cry was sharp with fear as she saw the blood staining his coat. "Dear God, what happened?" "Railroad man," he managed through clenched teeth. "Ambush." Together they made it inside. Rona helped him to their bed, her hands swift and sure as she tore open his shirt to examine the wound. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along his ribs, angry and red against his pale skin. "Hold still," she commanded, voice steady though her eyes shimmered with tears. She moved quickly, gathering supplies from her trunk, clean cloths, herbs, and a small bottle of whiskey she'd been saving for medicine. Luke groaned as she cleaned the wound, the whiskey burning worse than the bullet. But Rona's touch was gentle, her prayers a constant murmur as she worked. She crushed dried herbs into a poultice, binding it tight against his side. "Stay with me," she whispered, wiping his face with a cool cloth. "Just stay with me, Luke." Fever took him as night fell. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of Rona's presence beside him. Sometimes he felt her hand in his, other times the touch of a damp cloth on his brow. Through it all, her voice remained constant, praying, humming hymns, speaking words of love and comfort. Comfort. In his delirium, Luke called her name again and again. Each time, she answered, "I'm here." The certainty in her voice anchored him, keeping him from slipping too far into darkness. He realized in those fevered hours that she had become as necessary to him as air, that living without her was no longer possible. The night seemed endless, but Rona never left his side. She tended the fire, changed his bandages, and coaxed him to drink water whenever he was lucid enough. Her hands remained steady even as exhaustion dragged at her, her faith never wavering as she prayed for his healing. When dawn finally broke, it found Luke awake and clear-eyed for the first time since the shooting. He was weak as a newborn colt, but the fever had broken. Rona sat beside him, her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes bright with joy and unshed tears. "Welcome back," she whispered, touching his cheek with trembling fingers. Luke caught her hand, pressing it to his lips. "You saved me." "God saved you," she corrected gently. "I just helped a little. You never left me." His voice was hoarse but full of wonder. "I never will." Rona's tears finally fell, dropping soft as rain on their clasped hands. "For better or worse, remember?" Luke pulled her close, ignoring the protest from his wounded side. They held each other as morning light filled the cabin, each grateful for the gift of another dawn together. Days stretched into a gentle rhythm as Rona tended to Luke's recovery. Morning light would find her changing his bandages, her touch careful as she applied fresh herb poultices to the healing wound. The cabin, filled with the scent of medicinal teas and the soft sound of her voice reading from her warm Bible. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read one morning, seated beside their bed. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Luke listened, his eyes closed but his mind alert. The familiar words took on new meaning in her voice, bringing comfort he'd never known before. When she finished, he tried to repeat the verses, stumbling over the ancient phrases. "That's good," Rona encouraged, smiling. "Each day you grow stronger in body and spirit." As afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, she taught him more psalms, patient when he forgot words or mixed up verses. Luke found himself drawn to the ones about deliverance and justice, seeing his own struggles reflected in those ancient songs. "I reckon David knew something about being cornered," he said one evening as Rona stoked the fire. "Like us with the railroad men." She nodded, settling beside him. He never lost faith that God would make things right. Luke shifted, wincing slightly at the pull of healing flesh. "Before you came, I thought myself cursed." His voice grew rough with emotion. "Lost my family, lost my way. Figured God had turned his back." "Oh, Luke." Rona took his hand, her own warm and steady. "God never turned away. He was leading me to you all along." "Through a mockery wedding?" Luke's mouth twisted, remembering that day. Through whatever path was needed. Her eyes held absolute conviction. "I believe he brought me here with purpose, not just for us, but for this land and its people." Our words stirred something in Luke's chest. "The strong box," he said suddenly. "We should look again. There might be something we missed." Rona retrieved the iron box, setting it on the bed between them. Together, they sorted through the papers, land deeds, letters, surveyors' maps. Luke's hands, stronger now, carefully unfolded each document. "Wait," he paused, holding a thick folded paper he hadn't noticed before. It had been stuck to another document, hidden in the creases. With trembling fingers, he opened it. There, clear as sunrise, was the territorial governor's seal, not just a stamp, but his full official seal in red wax, complete with ribbon. The treaty document detailed the original land grant, signed and witnessed properly. "Rona," Luke's voice shook. "This proves it. Your brother's claim was legal and binding. The railroad can't touch it." She leaned close, reading the formal language with wide eyes. "The governor himself guaranteed the boundaries." Her finger traced the elaborate seal. "This is what we needed." Luke pushed himself straighter, ignoring the twinge in his side. "I have to take this to town. Show the sheriff, make him acknowledge the truth." "You're not fully healed," Rona protested, but her eyes shone with hope. "Strong enough." Luke caught her hand. "We can't wait. The railroad men could come any day." Rona was quiet for a moment, considering. Finally, she nodded. "But we do this right. We go to the church first, not the saloon. Show Pastor Ellis and let him witness it proper." "God's way," Luke agreed, understanding her wisdom. Justice needed to come through light, not darkness. "God's way," she echoed, carefully refolding the precious document. "We'll go tomorrow together." Luke pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of herbs and soap that always surrounded her. In the firelight, he studied her face, the gentle strength that had saved him in more ways than one. "I never thought I'd be grateful for a just wedding," he murmured. Rona smiled, touching his cheek. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, remember, even through the mockery of men." The treaty document lay between them, its red seal catching the firelight like a promise. Tomorrow they would face the town again, but tonight they had hope in each other. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady, while inside the cabin glowed with warmth and purpose. Luke held Rona close, their hearts beating in quiet harmony as they watched the flames dance. Knowing that at last they had found the key to their future. Dawn broke clear and cold that Sunday morning. Luke adjusted the sling that held his healing arm as Rona helped him mount his horse. Her own Mars stamped restlessly in the fresh snow, breath steaming in the winter air. They had dressed in their finest clothes, Luke in a press shirt and his least warm coat, Rona in her blue Sunday dress with a warm shawl wrapped tight. The treaty document rested secure in Luke's inner pocket, close to his heart. Its weight reminded him of everything at stake. He glanced at Rona, seeing the same mix of anxiety and determination in her eyes that he felt in his own chest. "Ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, gathering her reins. "The Lord goes before us." They rode slowly down the mountain trail, horses picking careful paths through patches of ice. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted valley, Rona's valley. Luke reminded himself. The land that was rightfully hers. Silver Bluff's church bell tolled across the frozen air, calling the faithful to worship. As they approached town, Luke saw carriages and wagons already gathered, townsfolk hurrying inside the white-painted building. His jaw tightened at the sight of the railroad baron's fine buggy stationed prominently near the steps. "Steady now," Rona murmured, more to herself than Luke. Her gloved hands gripped her reins tighter. They dismounted carefully, Luke hiding his wince as the movement pulled at his healing wound. Rona's warm hand found his good arm, steadying him. Together they climbed the church steps, boots creaking on frozen wood. Inside, the single room glowed with lamplight and morning sun streaming through frosted windows. Heads turned as they entered. Luke felt the weight of every stare. The miners and their wives, the shopkeepers, the railroad men gathered near the front pew. The Baron himself sat smugly in the place of honor, his neat suit and gold watch chain. Declaring his wealth and power, Pastor Ellis stood at his simple pulpit, already beginning the morning prayers. His gentle voice faltered slightly as he noticed Luke and Rona, but he continued, "Let us bow our heads and ask the Lord's blessing." Luke waited through the opening prayer, his hand pressed against the treaty in his pocket. When Ellis raised his head to begin his sermon, Luke stepped forward into the center aisle. "Begging your pardon, Pastor," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "But there's a matter of truth that needs speaking today." Ellis blinked, startled. The Baron's face darkened with anger at the interruption. Luke drew out the treaty document, unfolding it carefully with his good hand. The paper crackled in the silence. "This here's a treaty signed by the territorial governor himself." He held it high so all could see the red wax seal dangling from its ribbon. "It grants full rights to this valley to Thomas Duncan and his heirs, meaning his sister, my wife, Rona Bell." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. The Baron shot to his feet. "Preposterous! A clear forgery. I won't stand for this disruption of the Lord's day." "Then you won't mind if Pastor Ellis examines the seal." Rona spoke up from beside Luke, her voice steady. "He's known for his knowledge of such things." All eyes turned to Ellis, who hesitated only a moment before stepping down from his pulpit. Luke handed him the document, watching as the pastor adjusted his spectacles and studied the seal intently. The silence stretched. Luke could hear his own heart pounding. Rona's hand found his, squeezing tight. Finally, Ellis looked up. "This seal is authentic," he declared. "The ribbon, the wax impression, these match exactly the governor's official mark. I've seen it many times on church charters." He turned to face the congregation. "This treaty is genuine. Genuine." The Baron's face flushed dark red. "Impossible. You're all conspiring against progress." He snatched his hat from the pew and stormed toward the door, his men scrambling to follow Dodd as the door slammed behind them. The church erupted in excited whispers. Luke saw amazement, respect, and even shame on faces that had once mocked his wife. Rona stood tall beside him, her chin lifted, tears shining in her eyes, but refusing to fall. Ellis cleared his throat. Perhaps we should give thanks for truth revealed," he suggested. "Mrs. Harlan, would you lead us in prayer?" Rona stepped forward, her voice clear and strong as she began, "Heavenly Father, we thank you for your justice." Luke watched his wife, no longer the object of cruel jokes, but a woman commanding respect, and felt pride swell in his chest. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the golden cross on the altar and the tears on more, then a few cheeks as Rona's prayer filled the sacred space. The truth had been spoken. The land was secure, and in this moment, watching his wife stand gracefully before those who had once scorned her, Luke knew that God's justice had worked through their love in ways he never could have imagined thought in the hushed church. Luke's boots scuffed against the wooden floor as he turned to face the congregation. His hands trembled slightly as he drew himself up tall, ignoring the ache in his wounded side. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the tears in his eyes. "Folks," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "you all remember that day you pushed me to marry Rona Bell. You thought it was a fine joke." He swallowed hard, looking at the faces that had once laughed so cruelly. "But God works in ways we can't reckon. What you meant for mockery turned out to be the greatest blessing of my life." Rona's breath caught audibly as Luke continued, his voice growing stronger. "I was blind, then blind to her courage, her kindness, her faith. But now I see clear as day. This woman," his voice cracked, "this woman saved more than just my land. She saved my soul from darkness." Tears rolled freely down weather-worn cheeks throughout the congregation. Women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even the miners who had jeered loudest that day looked down at their boots, shamefaced, and moved. Rhona stood with her head bowed, tears falling silently as Luke spoke words she'd longed to hear. "I thank the Lord every day for sending her to me," Luke declared. "And I thank him for opening my eyes to see the treasure you all tried to throw away." The silence in the church was absolute. Then someone began to clap. The applause spread like wildfire through the pews, building to a thunderous sound that shook the rafters. Women who had once whispered cruel gossip now wept openly. Men who had mocked now stood in respect. Through it all, Luke kept his eyes on Rhona, watching as she raised her tear-stained face to meet his gaze with pure joy. Weeks passed like gentle rain, washing away the bitter memories of that first mocking wedding. In the fertile valley that Rhona's brother had cherished, Luke and Rhona worked side by side, their love growing stronger with each passing day. Luke's calloused hands drove fence posts into the rich soil, while Rhona scattered winter wheat seeds behind him. The late autumn sun painted their shadows long across the land they now shared. Each evening, they returned to their cabin, tired but content that their home grew warmer, not just from the crackling hearth, but from the hearts within. 3 orphaned children from town siblings whose parents had been lost to fever now filled the once quiet rooms with laughter. Sarah, aged 10, helped Rhona with baking. Thomas, 8, followed Luke like a shadow, learning to tend the animals. Little Mary, just 6, sang hymns in her sweet voice while playing with her rag doll by the fire. Travelers and widows found their way to the cabin door, drawn by stories of the kind-hearted couple who never turned away those in need. Rhona's fresh bread and Luke's hearty stew became famous across the territory. The home that had once known only loneliness now buzzed with life and love. On quiet evenings, Luke sat in his chair by the fire, watching Rhona teach the children their letters. The lamplight caught the silver threading through her hair, and his heart swelled with gratitude. She'd notice his gaze and smile, her eyes twinkling with the same joy that had sustained her through mockery and hardship. What had begun as a cruel joke had blossomed into something sacred, a family built on faith, forgiveness, and fierce love. The mountain man who'd lived so long in solitude now found himself surrounded by the very thing he'd feared to lose again. A home filled with hope and the promise of tomorrow. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.